What if the most important evidence in this case wasn't a confession, wasn't a witness statement, and wasn't even a weapon? What if a single piece of footage overlooked, misunderstood, or released too late has the power to rewrite the entire narrative of the murder that shocked a nation? Because in the case surrounding the killing of Charlie Kirk, this is no longer just about who pulled the trigger. It's about what the camera saw, what the timeline reveals, and whether the story the public was told is the full story at all. Footage doesn't lie, but it can mislead. And depending on how it's interpreted, this evidence could either cement the prosecution's case or blow a hole straight through it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If this footage proves even one assumption wrong, then everything that followed arrests, charges, even courtroom decisions comes into question. Before we go any further, understand this. Cases aren't decided by emotion. They're decided by evidence, timing, and procedure. And today, all three are under scrutiny. Now, before you continue watching, do me a quick favor. If you care about truth over headlines, facts over assumptions, and justice over speed, like this video, share it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And when you comment, tell me, do you think video footage can change the outcome of a case like this? Before we examine the footage and why it matters, we need to ground ourselves in the undisputed facts of this case. Not opinions, not online theories, just what is publicly known so far. Charlie Kirk was attending a public speaking event on the campus of Utah Valley University. The event was open, well attended, and drew a large crowd of students, supporters, critics, and bystanders alike. By most accounts, thousands of people were present on or around campus that day. At some point during the event, a single gunshot rang out. Charlie Kirk was struck and died at the scene. Detail matters because it shows just how unstable and fast-moving the situation was in the hours that followed. More than a day later, authorities announced that a 22-year-old man, Tyler Robinson, had been arrested and charged in connection with the shooting. Prosecutors allege that Robinson acted alone. They allege premeditation. And they allege that the evidence, physical, digital, and circumstantial, points squarely in his direction. Robinson now faces multiple serious charges, including aggravated murder, with the possibility of the death penalty if convicted. From the outside, this might appear straightforward. A public shooting. A suspect identified. Charges filed. But cases like this are rarely that simple. Because while the public focused on who was arrested, investigators, attorneys, and eventually the courts began focusing on something else entirely. How the case was built, when critical information surfaced, and whether the process itself can withstand scrutiny. To shift, because everything that follows from witness accounts to digital evidence to courtroom battles depends on one crucial factor: the timeline. And in this case, the timeline may be the prosecution's greatest strength or its greatest vulnerability. To understand why this case is so contested, we have to slow everything down and reconstruct the day of the shooting as carefully as possible. Because in criminal cases, especially ones involving public events, minutes matter. Sometimes, seconds do. The event took place during daylight hours on the campus of Utah Valley University. The atmosphere, by most accounts, was charged but controlled. Charlie Kirk was engaging with the audience, taking questions, speaking openly, and moving through the event as planned. Nothing about the setting suggested what was about to happen. Then, without warning, a single gunshot cut through the crowd. There was no immediate clarity about where the sound came from. People didn't know if there would be more shots. Some dropped to the ground. Others ran. Many froze. In those first moments, fear spread faster than information. Law enforcement responded quickly. Officers began securing the area, pushing people to safety and attempting to identify the source of the shot. The campus was placed on lockdown as authorities worked under the assumption that the threat might still be active. At the same time, information began spreading both officially and unofficially. Witnesses were calling loved ones. Social media posts were going up in real time. Rumors filled the gaps where confirmed details didn't yet exist. Even agencies involved in the response would later acknowledge that early reports were inconsistent and, in some cases, incorrect. This matters because in chaotic scenes like this, memory is fragile. People experience events differently under stress. What one person thinks happened at a certain moment may not align perfectly with timestamps, camera footage, or haju logs. As the hours passed, investigators began collecting evidence. Witness statements, surveillance footage from surrounding areas, digital data tied to movements and communications. But this wasn't a quiet, contained crime scene. This was a public campus with thousands of potential witnesses, countless phones recording pieces of the aftermath, and multiple camera angles, some fixed, some moving, some incomplete. More than 30 hours later, authorities announced an arrest. That delay alone has fueled intense debate. Not because delays are unusual, but because during that window, narratives form, suspicions harden. Early assumptions can shape how later evidence is interpreted. And this is where footage becomes critical. Because video doesn't experience fear. It doesn't panic. It doesn't forget. But it also doesn't explain itself. And as we're about to see, what the cameras captured and what they didn't may hold the key to understanding whether the official timeline holds up under pressure. In nearly every modern criminal case, video evidence carries an almost mythical weight. To the public, footage feels definitive, clear, objective, undeniable. But in courtrooms, video is treated very differently. It's powerful, yes, but only when it's properly understood, properly timed, and properly contextualized. And in this case, the footage in question may be one of the most consequential pieces of evidence yet. The video did not come from a single source. Instead, it emerged from multiple angle surveillance cameras positioned around campus. Security footage from nearby buildings and recordings captured by individuals in the moments before and after the shooting. Some of this footage surfaced quickly. Other portions appeared later as investigators worked to reconstruct movements across a wide and complex scene. What makes this footage so important is not just what it shows, but when it shows it. According to those familiar with the evidence, the video captures key moments surrounding the shooting, movement across rooftops, activity near buildings, and individuals entering and exiting specific areas within narrow time windows. None of this footage, on its own, tells a complete story. But together, it begins to form a visual timeline. And timelines are everything in criminal law. Prosecutors argue that the footage supports their version of events, that it aligns with witness accounts, supports the identification of the suspect, and reinforces the theory of how the shooting occurred. The defense sees it very differently. From their perspective, the footage raises questions rather than answers them. Questions about angles, visibility, distance, and most importantly, interpretation. A shadow moving across a rooftop, a figure running. A moment that looks clear at first glance but becomes far more ambiguous when slowed down, zoomed in, or viewed frame by frame. Because here's the truth about video evidence. It doesn't show intent. It doesn't show state of mind. And it doesn't always show what people think they're seeing. Lighting, perspective, frame rate, and camera placement all matter. A movement that appears suspicious from one angle may look entirely different from another. And in a case where seconds count, even a small discrepancy can have massive legal implications. That's why this footage isn't just being reviewed, it's being dissected. Attorneys are asking, does the footage align with the prosecution's timeline? Does it contradict any witness statements? Does it introduce reasonable doubt about sequence or opportunity? And perhaps most importantly, was this footage interpreted after conclusions were formed? Or before? Because if evidence is used to confirm an assumption rather than test it, that's when cases begin to unravel. And the deeper investigators go into this video, the clearer it becomes that this isn't just background material. This footage sits at the center of the case, quietly challenging everything built around it. This is where the case stops being emotional and starts becoming mathematical. Because evidence doesn't exist in isolation. Every piece must line up with something else, a timestamp, a statement, a movement, a response. And when video footage enters the picture, it becomes the measuring stick against which all other claims are tested. Investigators began by syncing the footage with known markers, emergency call logs, campus security timestamps, and law enforcement response times. On paper, the sequence appears orderly. But when placed side by side with witness statements, subtle tensions begin to emerge. Some witnesses reported hearing the gunshot and seeing movement almost immediately afterward. Others described confusion sounds echoing, people running in multiple directions, and uncertainty about where the shot came from. That's not unusual in high-stress situations. What matters is whether the footage confirms or contradicts those recollections. In several instances, the video seems to support broad elements of the prosecution's timeline general movement patterns, crowd reactions, and law enforcement presence. But in other moments, the footage introduces gray areas, gaps of seconds, blind spots where cameras don't reach, transitions between angles where continuity depends on interpretation rather than certainty. And those gaps matter. For example, if a figure appears on one camera at a certain time, and then appears again elsewhere seconds later, the distance between those points becomes critical. Could that movement physically occur within that window? Does it match the speed described by witnesses? Or does it raise questions about whether assumptions are being made to bridge missing frames? Defense attorneys focus intensely on these moments not because they prove innocence outright, but because they test the strength of the narrative being presented. In court, it's not enough for a story to make sense. It has to make sense without forcing the evidence to cooperate. Law enforcement actions are also examined under this lens. When officers moved in, when certain areas were secured, when specific pieces of footage were reviewed or logged. Even small delays can affect how evidence is perceived and, whether later, interpretations were influenced by earlier conclusions. This is where confirmation bias becomes a real concern. If investigators believe they know who they're looking for, there's a risk sometimes unconscious that evidence is viewed through that lens. Video that could be neutral becomes incriminating. Ambiguity gets resolved in one direction. And that's why courts demand more than alignment. They demand consistency. At this stage, the footage neither conclusively confirms nor completely dismantles the case. Instead, it does something far more dangerous for the prosecution. It introduces questions that don't have easy answers. And when questions pile up around timing, movement, and interpretation, reasonable doubt begins to take shape not in theory but in practice. In today's world, a criminal case is rarely decided by physical evidence alone. Digital footprints, texts, calls, social media activity can be just as decisive if interpreted correctly. And in this case, the digital trail may be as significant as the footage itself. Investigators have noted a series of messages sent by Tyler Robinson in the hours immediately following the shooting. These communications include references to movements near the campus, mentions of locations later corroborated by surveillance, and timestamps that place him near key points in the timeline. Prosecutors argue that these messages establish intent, opportunity, and awareness. In other words, they suggest that Robinson knew what had happened and where he needed to be evidence that reinforces the narrative, constructed from the footage and witness statements. The defense, however, approaches this differently. They argue that context is everything. A single line in a text, when isolated, can appear incriminating, but the surrounding circumstances may completely change its meaning. Emotional distress, panic, or confusion can drastically alter the way a message is phrased or sent. Additionally, the timing of the messages matters immensely. Did these communications occur before law enforcement secured the scene or after? Were they reacting to the chaos or guiding it? These questions go to the heart of whether the digital evidence proves guilt or simply shows a person caught in a confusing and terrifying situation. There is also the matter of access and verification. Phones can be manipulated, timestamps can be misread, and metadata can be incomplete. A single error in understanding these details can dramatically shift how evidence is interpreted in court. Taken together, the footage and digital trail form a complex web. They intersect, sometimes corroborate, sometimes conflict, but they are not self-explanatory. Each piece must be scrutinized for accuracy, timing, and potential bias. And this leads to a critical point. In a case like this, procedural integrity matters as much as evidence itself. Even the strongest evidence can be challenged if the process of collecting or interpreting it raises doubt. In any high-profile murder case, evidence alone rarely determines the outcome. Procedure, ethics, and courtroom strategy often play an equally decisive role. And in the case of Charlie Kirk, that reality has now taken center stage. Tyler Robinson's defense team has filed a motion to disqualify the entire Utah County Attorney's Office from the case. Why? Because of a potential conflict of interest involving a member of the prosecution team who has a personal connection to a direct witness to the shooting. According to court filings, this prosecutor received text messages in real time about the shooting from a family member present at the event. Within minutes, messages included observations like, "Someone got shot. Charlie got shot. People say he was shot in the neck." These messages, sent mere minutes after the incident, were reportedly discussed within the prosecution team before disclosure to the defense. From a procedural standpoint, this raises serious questions. The defense argues that a person with personal ties to a witness cannot fully separate family loyalty from professional duty. Even if the prosecutor acts with complete integrity, the appearance of bias is enough to jeopardize the fairness of a capital trial. The motion also highlights broader issues. No screening protocol was in place to prevent conflict of interest exposure. Sensitive information about witnesses may have been shared among the prosecutorial team. The trauma experienced by those involved, including the prosecutor's family member, could influence perception and decision-making, even subconsciously. Courts take these claims seriously. Capital cases where the death penalty is on the table demand the highest standard of ethical conduct. if a judge finds that even one member of the prosecution team has a conflict that cannot be mitigated. It could result in partial or full disqualification. In other words, the strength of the evidence footage. Digital communications and witness statements may be overshadowed by procedural and ethical vulnerabilities. Witness statements included in the motion paint a chilling picture of the day. Fear, blood, chaos, and panic that affected everyone on campus. The defense argues that these traumatic experiences, combined with the prosecutor's personal connection, create a risk that cannot be ignored. This isn't about guilt or innocence, it's about the integrity of the trial process. Because in court, even the most compelling evidence can be dismissed if the process itself is compromised. At this point, it's crucial to separate perception from legal reality. Footage can be compelling. It can make events feel immediate, undeniable, and absolute. But in a courtroom, what footage shows and what it legally proves are not always the same thing. Here's what the footage does show. Movement, patterns of individuals near the scene. The general chaos immediately following the shooting. Some interactions between potential witnesses and bystanders. Moments that align with portions of the official timeline. In short, it provides a visual record of the environment and some key events, helping to corroborate or challenge witness statements. But here's what it does not prove. Intent. Video cannot show what someone was thinking or planning. Motive. Footage rarely explains why something happened. Context. Without corroborating evidence, a single frame can be misleading. Absolute identification. Shadows, angles, and blurry images can create misinterpretations. Defense attorneys will emphasize these points. Even a seemingly incriminating frame can be explained, contradicted, or deemed insufficient on its own to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This is why courts insist on triangulating evidence footage. Witness statements, digital records, and physical evidence all together. Each piece must support the others without significant contradictions. If the visual evidence contradicts key testimony, or if it leaves important questions unanswered, it can weaken the prosecution's narrative considerably. The takeaway for viewers is simple. Video evidence is powerful but not infallible. It informs the story. It can guide investigations, and it can influence jurors, but it is never the story itself. With the footage analyzed, the digital trail examined, and ethical questions surrounding the prosecution raised, the next chapter in this case moves squarely into the courtroom. And in cases like this, the courtroom can be as consequential as the crime itself. The first step is likely to be a hearing on the defense's motion to disqualify the Utah County Attorney's Office. Judges will carefully consider whether the alleged conflict of interest is serious enough to require partial or full reassignment of the case. This is not merely procedural if a judge agrees. It could delay the trial for weeks or even months, altering how evidence is presented and how the public perceives the case. At the same time, both sides are preparing for intense scrutiny of the footage. Prosecutors will attempt to demonstrate that the video aligns with their timeline and supports the suspect SE identification. The defense, on the other hand, will challenge it on multiple fronts: gaps in the frames, perspective issues, potential inconsistencies, and the emotional context of the people captured. Expect motions to suppress or limit digital evidence as well. Texts, calls, and metadata may be contested, with debates over authenticity, timing, and interpretation. The interplay between footage and digital communication could shape the narrative in ways that neither side predicted. Meanwhile, witnesses are being prepared for testimony. Attorneys are reviewing statements, anticipating cross-examination questions, and rehearsing the presentation of trauma in a way that is legally permissible but impactful. Every detail matters, from what a witness saw to what they heard, to how quickly law enforcement responded. It's also possible that this case could attract additional legal scrutiny from higher courts if procedural concerns aren't addressed early. Ethical breaches or conflicts even, minor ones, can result in appeals that delay justice for years. And for the public watching, it's important to understand that the story is still unfolding. The footage, compelling as it may be, is only one piece of a complex puzzle that includes procedural ethics, timeline alignment, witness reliability, legaustragy, all of which will determine not just guilt or innocence, but whether the trial itself stands up to scrutiny. Even with footage, digital evidence, and witness statements, some questions remain unresolved. And in criminal law, unanswered questions are often where reasonable doubt lives. Did the footage capture every critical moment, or are there gaps that could change interpretations? Can the prosecutor's office fully separate professional duty from personal connections, or does the appearance of bias undermine the case? How will the jury weigh conflicting timelines, emotional witness testimony, and video evidence that may be incomplete or ambiguous? Are there additional digital communications or surveillance recordings yet to be discovered that could shift the narrative entirely? These questions are not just hypothetical, they matter in practice. Each one could influence whether the trial proceeds smoothly, is delayed, or is challenged on appeal. For viewers, the takeaway is clear. Justice is not determined by video alone. Even the most dramatic footage cannot replace careful legal scrutiny, ethical integrity, and methodical investigation. And sometimes, the process itself becomes the most critical element of the case. I'm Detective B. If you're fascinated by real life, mysteries, and criminal investigations, tap like, subscribe, and share your opinion in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about today's case. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, in true crime, the line between fact and perception is often thinner than we realize.